Therapists with Expertise by Experience, a report on a survey by Val Hewitt and Sue Holtom. This presentation is based on a paper just out in the International Journal of Art Therapy. Val Hewitt is the CEO of the British Association of Art Therapists, and I work on the Salomons Clinical Psychology Training Programme. And I think that the findings from this survey have relevance to clinical psychology training as well as to art therapy training. We know that there is prejudice against people with mental health problems amongst professionals, and there's some evidence that it's even worse than amongst the general public. Clinical psychology applicants tend not to disclose or declare a mental health problem, whereas they may declare dyslexia. It's less than 1%, and that's how it's been for several years. But of course we know that according to Mind, the prevalence in the population is more like 1 in 4, or 25%. The British Association of Art Therapists surveyed its membership to look at experience of both mental distress and being an art therapist. Art therapy is an HCPC registered psychological therapy, and art therapists have an art degree and a 2-year master's in art therapy, which involves classroom learning, experiential groups and placements. Art therapists work with a range of service users, and they have a tradition of working with severe mental distress, where they use art, amongst other things, to create a safe way of beginning to relate when direct interaction can be very difficult. So the British Association of Art Therapists survey was on people who had experience of both being an art therapist and being a service user, mental health service user. There were 19 respondents, which is a very small percentage of the overall pool of art therapists. It's only about 1.5%. So this could again illustrate reluctance to disclose. Of these 19, 15 had service user experience before training, and most of them also had experience during their training. Looking at those who disclosed at interview, only 4 out of 15 who had already had experience of mental distress, only 4 disclosed this at interview, and 3 out of the 4 reported positive responses, and 1 felt that the interviewers made unhelpful assumptions. We asked people for reasons why they did or didn't disclose, and the top 4 reasons for not disclosing were fear of negative judgment, fear about the view that would be taken of their competence or coping, fear of not getting on the course if it was at the interview, and just a feeling that professionals don't disclose. For example, I was scared it would influence the decision to accept me, like an unwritten rule not to disclose. Reasons for disclosing: 4 people said that their experience was relevant to the learning, 4 said that their experience was evident in their artwork, because of course artwork is a core part of art therapy training and people also bring artwork to the interview, and 4 said distress was visible or was disrupting their work. So some examples: I discussed it with peers when it was relevant, tutors also, when relevant or adding to the learning. The issues were in the paintings I had taken to interview. We also asked about reactions to disclosure, but there isn't time to present that here. That is in our paper. We asked people about what they thought the effects were on their practice of having had experience of mental distress, and there were 7 different sorts of challenges that people mentioned. Here are just some of them. 6 people talked about lack of confidence, 4 talked about need for one's own care or containment, 3 talked about the belief that therapists should not be distressed, and 3 talked about worrying about getting ill again. So an example: I worry about my effect on service users a lot. Am I going to make them ill? So that's the lack of confidence issue. However, when you look at the positive side, there were 11 sorts of bonus that people mentioned, and top of the list was feeling more empathy because I've been there. 8 people talked about being better able to recognise and to admit one's own limitations. 6 people talked about the ability to sit or work with distress, ability to work collaboratively with clients. 5 people talked about bringing hope where others might not. Here's some examples. I could connect with patients from an even more sensitive place than usual. I'm more aware of my limits and looking after myself. I bring hope and belief in recovery and have discovered that I am often the first person to hold that attitude with them. This was someone talking about a particular client group who had the same diagnosis as this person had, and I think this is a very interesting quote. Now, these kinds of findings are consistent with those of Gilbert and Stickley, 2012, for nursing and social work students with expertise by experience. For example, they reported increased empathy. And in discussing psychiatry, Roberts and Boardman, 2014, talked about it being important to own and draw on one's own distress during training in the recovery approach, as it fosters empathy with service users. And here's a slightly longer quote. Two placement supervisors encouraged me to talk about my own experiences that were relevant. I learned more from the supervisors than any others from being allowed to do this. I could bring in all parts of myself. It became useful, valuable knowledge that I could use as a therapist in positive ways to aid my understanding of myself and my clients. I think the idea about bringing in all parts of oneself is a really interesting one, and it is consistent with Richards, Holtom and Springham 2016, which was a study that looked at the discourses practitioners used, various practitioners from volunteer mental health workers to psychiatry, nursing assistants and others. Two of the discourses they found were one of personhood and one of use of self, and I see this kind of discourse as an antidote to the temptation to categorise people. We categorise people as professionals or as service users, and we can also categorise practitioners or professionals who have experience of mental distress. We can categorise them negatively as kind of flawed professionals, not as good as other professionals, or positively as extra special professionals. They've got something other professionals don't have. And I don't think really either of those is particularly helpful. But if you use a discourse of personhood, then you're emphasising that we're all people, and perhaps we should all be able to bring all parts of ourselves, and there shouldn't be parts of ourselves that we can't bring because there's some sort of stigma or taboo. And I think the quote also highlights a role for clinical supervision in enabling people to use personal experience of mental distress as one kind of life experience. In a sense, it's no different from other kinds of life experience that people bring. Of course, it is unique to itself, as every experience is, but it shouldn't be regarded as lesser kind of experience. So to enable people to use that experience in terms of understanding and reflecting on its nature for both personal development and for people's practice. However, because supervisors may have been exposed to negative attitudes about these particular kinds of life experience, or they may be within a local work culture that has negative attitudes towards them, and some of these can be quite subtle, they may need some training or some support or both perhaps, to facilitate trainees in learning from experience of mental distress. And also, it may require a wider cultural change. And perhaps there needs to be a wide debate about the issue, because there are some quite complex issues. There were the challenges that people were aware of. They were aware that having that experience of mental distress gave rise to challenges, but there are also opportunities to be drawn upon, and some very positive opportunities, it seems to me. Here are the references, which if you have a copy of these slides, you will have those. And this is my email address, sue.oldham@canterbury.ac.uk. And just to say that the reason why I teamed up with Val Hewitt is that I spend part of my week as the BAT research officer, and I have been very much enjoying the collaborative work that I've been doing with art therapists. And I think that the British Association of Art Therapists is doing some really exciting and groundbreaking work, and I'm really pleased to be involved in some of the work that they're doing. Thank you for listening.